Welcome to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. I'm Sarah Thompson, and joining me today is Michael Chen.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's topic.
That's right, Michael. Today we're going to be discussing a landmark case in Indian constitutional law that has had far-reaching implications for the rights of accused persons and the conduct of police investigations. The case is Nandini Sathpathy v. P.L. Dani, decided by the Supreme Court of India in 1978.
This case is fascinating, Sarah, because it deals with some fundamental questions about the balance between individual rights and the needs of law enforcement. At its core, it's about interpreting Article 23 of the Indian Constitution, which protects against self-incrimination.
Exactly. For our listeners who might not be familiar with the Indian legal system, can you give us a quick overview of what Article 23 says?
Of course. Article 23 states that no person accused of any offense shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. This is similar to the Fifth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, which protects against self-incrimination.
And in this case, the Supreme Court was asked to interpret the scope and meaning of this protection. What was the background of the case?
The case involved Nandini Sathpathy, a former chief minister of Orissa. She was being investigated for corruption and was asked to appear at a police station for questioning. When she refused to answer certain questions, citing her right against self-incrimination, she was charged under Section 179 of the Indian Penal Code for refusing to answer a public servant.
That's quite a situation. So essentially, she was being prosecuted for exercising what she believed to be her constitutional right?
Exactly. And this is where the case gets really interesting, because it forced the Supreme Court to grapple with some fundamental questions about the nature and extent of the protection against self-incrimination.
What were some of the key issues the court had to address?
There were several crucial questions. First, does the protection against self-incrimination apply only in court, or does it extend to police investigations as well? Second, who exactly is protected? Only those formally accused of a crime, or also suspects and potential accused? And third, what exactly constitutes compulsion to be a witness against oneself?
Those are some weighty questions. How did the court approach them?
The court took a very expansive and protective view of the right against self-incrimination. It held that the protection applies not just in court, but also during police investigations. This was a significant expansion of the right.
That seems like a major shift. What was the court's reasoning?
The court emphasized that the purpose of the protection is to prevent the abuse of police power and to protect the dignity and integrity of the individual. If the protection only applied in court, it would be too late. The damage of forced self-incrimination would already have been done during the investigation stage.
That makes sense. What about the question of who is protected?
Here, too, the court took a broad view. It held that the protection applies not just to those formally accused of a crime, but also to suspects and potential accused. The court recognized that in many cases, the line between a witness and an accused can be blurry, especially in the early stages of an investigation.
That seems like a very practical approach. Did the court give any guidance on how to determine if someone falls into this protected category?
Yes, it did. The court said that the key question is whether the person is in a position where they might reasonably apprehend that they could be implicated in an offense. It's not just about the current investigation, but also about potential future prosecutions.
That's fascinating. It really broadens the scope of protection. What about the third question? What constitutes compulsion?
This is where the court's ruling gets really interesting. The court recognized that compulsion isn't just about physical force or threats. It can also include more subtle forms of pressure, like the inherent coercion of being in a police station, or the psychological pressure of prolonged questioning.
That's a nuanced view. How did the court suggest this should be applied in practice?
The court gave some practical guidelines. For example, it said that the police should inform suspects of their right to remain silent. It also suggested that suspects should have the right to consult with a lawyer before and during questioning.
Those sound similar to the Miranda warnings in the U.S. Was the court influenced by American jurisprudence?
Good observation, Sarah. The court did reference Miranda v. Arizona and other U.S. cases, but it was careful to develop a distinctly Indian approach. The court emphasized that while it could learn from other jurisdictions, it needed to interpret the Indian Constitution in light of Indian realities and values.
That makes sense. India's legal system, while influenced by common law traditions, has its own unique features and challenges. Speaking of challenges, how did the court address the concern that this broad interpretation might hamper police investigations?
That's a great question, and it's one the court was very mindful of. The court recognized the legitimate needs of law enforcement and the importance of solving crimes. It tried to strike a balance by saying that while suspects have the right to remain silent, they don't have the right to lie. The court also emphasized that the police can still ask questions and conduct investigations. They just can't compel self-incriminatory answers.
It sounds like a delicate balance. Did the court give any guidance on how to determine if a question or answer is self-incriminatory?
Yes, and this is another area where the court took a broad view. It said that a statement doesn't have to be directly confessional to be protected. Even answers that might form a link in the chain of evidence against the accused are protected. The court said to look at the totality of the circumstances, not just the question in isolation, but how it fits into the broader context of the investigation and the accused situation.
That's quite a comprehensive approach. It seems like it would require a lot of careful judgment on the part of investigators and courts.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why this case is so significant. It really raised the bar for police investigations and forced a reevaluation of many standard practices.
I can imagine this decision must have had quite an impact on police procedures. Did the court address how its ruling should be implemented in practice?
Yes, and this is one of the most interesting aspects of the judgment. The court recognized that simply stating legal principles wasn't enough. They needed to be translated into practical guidelines that could be followed by police officers on the ground.
What kind of guidelines did the court suggest?
There were several. For instance, the court recognized that in many parts of India, access to lawyers might be limited, so it suggested alternative safeguards, like having a magistrate or other neutral party present during questioning in some cases.
That's a thoughtful approach. Did the court address any other practical issues?
Yes, it did. One interesting point was about the location of questioning. The court emphasized that under Indian law, women and juveniles generally shouldn't be summoned to police stations for questioning. They should be questioned at their residences. The court was quite critical of the fact that in this case, Nandini Sathpathy had been summoned to the police station contrary to this rule.
That's an important point about gender sensitivity in law enforcement. Were there any other notable aspects of the judgment?
Absolutely. One of the most significant was the court's emphasis on the need for police reform and modernization. The court recognized that many problematic practices, like the use of third-degree methods, stemmed from a lack of training and resources.
Can you explain what third-degree methods are for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term?
Certainly. Third degree is a euphemism for coercive and often violent interrogation techniques. The court was very clear in condemning these practices, saying they have no place in a civilized society and are counterproductive to good policing.
That's a strong stance. How did the courts suggest addressing this issue?
The court called for a comprehensive overhaul of police training and practices. It emphasized the need for scientific investigation techniques, better forensic capabilities, and a shift away from over-reliance on confessions. The court saw this as not just a legal issue, but a broader question of police culture and societal attitudes.
That's quite a visionary approach. It seems like this judgment was about much more than interpreting a single constitutional provision.
You're absolutely right, Sarah. This judgment is often seen as a landmark, not just in constitutional law, but in the broader field of criminal justice reform in India. It really set the stage for a lot of subsequent developments in both law and policy.
That's fascinating. Before we wrap up, can you tell us what happened in Nandini Sathpathy's specific case?
Certainly. In light of its broader rulings, the court actually quashed the prosecution against Sathpathy for refusing to answer questions. But it did so on the condition that she agree to answer non-incriminatory questions in the future. The court was trying to balance respect for constitutional rights with the legitimate needs of the investigation.
That seems like a pragmatic resolution. Any final thoughts on the significance of this case?
I think the key takeaway is how the court managed to take a specific legal issue and use it as a springboard to address much broader questions of individual rights, the proper role of law enforcement, and the need for systemic reform. It's a great example of how constitutional interpretation can have far-reaching practical implications.
Thank you, Michael, for that insightful analysis, and thank you to our listeners for joining us for this deep dive into the Nandini Sathpathy case. Remember, understanding these landmark judgments is crucial for anyone interested in the development of constitutional rights and the criminal justice system. Until next time, this is Sarah Thompson.
And Michael Chen, signing off from the AskJunior Judgment Podcast.